Hi everyone, thank you for being here. I'm Jessica Sims. Today I am rather nervous, but equally eager to share a glimpse into a book I've been working on for less than a year, but thinking about for far longer. The current working title is Il de Jean Charles is Not Dead, Stories from the Front Line of the Nation's First Climate Relocation. You couldn't guess, it's about Il de Jean Charles resettlement, the first allocation of federal tax dollars to move a community struggling with the impacts of climate change. But more importantly, it's about the people at the heart of it. The islanders facing the decision to relocate away from their homes and whose stories and experiences it will center as they weigh the trade-offs. So a little roadmap. I'm going to start with the voices of a couple of the island residents on their decisions to move or not, and then walk you through a bit of background on land loss, the resettlement, my inspiration for and approach to writing the book, the goals for the book, and the next steps. Okay, the first quote.
Yes. Oh, yeah. You gotta keep watching the wind, which way the wind's blowing, watch that, you know. Pay attention to all that as I get caught in it. I grew up down there too, but it's not. It is the family land, but it is what it is for me.
So these clips are from interviews I did in 2018, so you can hear my little verbal affirmations in there. And the next one.
Because reality has set in. I realized that it is not. That road is sinking and it is disappearing. And sooner or later, if the road doesn't go, it's really just, you don't need now, then you're probably not a chance to live. One day time's gonna come, and there's always gonna be a good time. But either it's gonna be carried away, or and I'll try to convince my daddy.
Other islanders are also clear in where they stand in relation to the island, but they are choosing to stay. The final quote is from an islander who said to me shortly after I knocked on his door and introduced myself that he was not interested in the prospect of leaving the island. I belong to here, he said, slowly and deliberately, a smile playing across his mouth, and I ain't moving. For him, the rootedness to the island outweighs any dangers of staying. For those of you who may have forgotten, because there aren't new articles coming out every week, and for those of you who may be unaware of the Il de Jean Charles Resettlement Program, I'm going to give you a brief overview. So this is Il de Jean Charles, a couple of years ago, now a sliver of land off the coast of Louisiana, historically and currently home to Indigenous people. Before the resettlement, when many more people lived on the island, nearly every hurricane would displace more residents from their homes, their communities, and their ancestral homeland. Furthermore, over the last century and happening right now, the chronic disaster of coastal erosion, including from sea level rise, land subsidence, the exploration and cutting up of wetlands from oil canals, and the leveeing and straitjacketing of the Mississippi River are compounding to disappear the island's landmass and the land around it. And in 2021, the Army Corps' cost-benefit analysis excluded the island from a major protective levee system, subsequently increasing flooding to the island. So overall, the state of Louisiana loses approximately 25 to 35 square miles of land annually. So for context, that's an area larger than this island called Manhattan, where we are all sitting together today, that is gone every year. These are satellite images of Il de Jean Charles and show land loss over time. So the black and white photo on the bottom left is the earliest photo from 1963. So you can see the solid-ish land around it. Directly above that image on the top left is a color image from 22 years later. So the image on the top right is from 2017, and then the most recent Landsat image is from about 2 years ago in 2023. So you can compare, right, the images on the left to those on the right, and you can see how much land has been lost and how quickly. In the last 60 years or so, the island's lost 98%, at this point, probably a little more, of its original landmass. And modeling predicts in 50 years it will be gone. So the island may be getting smaller, it may be on life support, but it is not dead. Excuse me. The precarity and significance of the island to its community came into sharper focus in January 2016 when the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development HUD awarded the state of Louisiana $48.3 million. The money came from the National Disaster Resilience Competition and would fund the design, planning, and implementation of a community resettlement. A couple months later, the New York Times published the story on the front page, labeling the islanders the first American climate refugees in their Carbon's Casualties series, while also identifying a number of anticipated challenges. I want to clarify, though, that the New York Times, the New Yorker, and many other publications that use this label are incorrect. The islanders are not refugees. Refugee is a legal term and a protected status, and the label was offensive to many of them. However, what was happening at this time was that about a quarter of the island's 99 remaining residents had zero interest in moving, and then most didn't trust that the relocation would ever come to fruition, nor the new homes built, or that their island homes would not be bulldozed as a result. Long-standing and well-deserved distrust of the government was pervasive and frequently invoked. An acrimonious dispute between two state-recognized tribes that have tribal members on the island added further challenges and increased divisions. There were also divergent priorities for the state and the Jean-Charles Choctaw Nation tribal leadership, the two entities who had worked on the competition's application. These were never resolved. Reporters, rumors, and rancor began pouring in from all sides. Many of the residents then had to navigate these complications while contending with all sorts of other things like nostalgia or the loss and grief in experiencing dramatic community and landscape changes happening all around them. Fractures with family, identity, community, land, and belonging. Hurricanes and expensive and exhausting evacuations, all amidst the tangle of government promises. Though funded and designed to serve as a framework for future efforts, or as Marion McFadden, who oversaw the National Disaster Resilience Competition for HUD, said about the resettlement, we see this as setting a precedent for the rest of the country, the rest of the world. Inevitably, the resettlement process was complex, tense, and frequently contested. Indeed, it stands to provide valuable insights. Before I move on, I want to stress that there will almost always be multi-layered challenges, conflicts, divisions, and deep emotions during the course of a relocation. It's a sensitive, difficult process. And the underlying reasons the islanders and others like them are in the precarious position they are necessarily bring to bear issues of equity and justice. But that's why many of us are here, right? This isn't easy. We have to keep trying. We can't ignore the rights of those who are losing their homes to rising seas, sinking land, and other climate-fueled disasters. For these and many other reasons, it's important to me to write this book in partnership and reciprocity with islanders who today live in the New Isle community, many of whom use storytelling to preserve cultural memories and empower collective action. If this book sells and makes any money, I've committed to them to set up a New Isle community fund. So at this point, you may be asking, who is this Jessica Sims lady to be writing this book? And who am I, a non-Indigenous person, an outsider, a non-native Louisianan born and raised in Crazyfornia, as the president likes to tease me about? Who am I to be writing this book? Me, I've been working in the coastal Louisiana climate resilience and mobility space for about 15 years now. My master's thesis explored the politics of wetland restoration in Terrebonne Parish, where the island is located. My PhD at LSU in geography focused on how people in Terrebonne and next door Lafourche Parish are making decisions or not to relocate. In 2017, I began working as the Outreach and Engagement Coordinator for the Ile-de-Jean-Charles Resettlement for the Office of Community Development, the state of Louisiana. I worked for more than 4 years as a sort of liaison between the state and the island residents, where I approached my job with the intent to listen and learn from the folks engaging in the process. I went to the island about once a week, typically on Fridays, which made it feel like I had a 3-day weekend every week. While on the island, sitting under houses on porches and driveways, yards, kitchens, and living rooms, I tried to answer questions and provide updates. But I also was strengthening relationships, sharing parts of my life as the islanders shared theirs, getting to know folks and their families, histories, community, and individual strengths and needs. So why am I writing this book? For multiple years, this resettlement captivated people. Conversations about climate relocation frequently invoked the island resettlement. It has shaped the way that people think of climate displacement, and it's changed forever the way the US will approach climate-driven relocation. There's a lot to learn from it, and a lot that all of us can relate to in the stories of people forced to leave a home many of them never wanted to leave, but how extraordinarily difficult that decision ultimately was. Stories, such as those that will comprise the book, are a powerful way for readers to make sense of the real-life climate impacts and complexities embedded in relocation efforts. They can broaden cross-cultural understanding and strengthen partnerships for climate action. As Gary Nabhan, an ethnobotanist, said, "You can't have restoration without restoration to heal. We need to hear stories of a relationship with the land." The stakes are rapidly getting higher in this polycrisis, warranting collective action and all hands-on-deck undertaking. Many more hands are needed. The untold stories and lived experience of a historically underrepresented group's firsthand experience about the inequitable human costs of this crisis and its connections to the past offer much needed wisdom to inform our collective future. The $48 million, although touted to fund a climate relocation, is more than just a climate issue. It intersects with racial segregation, the housing crisis, Indian law, federal treaties, environmental racism, the human versus nature binary, all of which, in many cases, force communities of color to live in close proximity to unstable infrastructure, toxic chemicals, low-lying land in the path of hurricanes, etc. Indigenous peoples' land, rights, and culture are foundational to communities across the US, yet their perspectives are too often excluded from decision-making and public narratives. Repairing this requires centering Indigenous voices, honoring sovereignty, and ensuring their priorities shape the policies that affect our lives. The data that I'm using for this book comes predominantly from primary sources, like field notes from island visits, community meetings, design charrettes, and notes from program staff meetings. Semi-structured interviews and focus groups with residents in 2018, and again, after folks had moved into their new homes in 2023. Audio notes and voice memos, emails, texts, voicemails, and surveys with project team members. Also, of course, secondary sources like archival newspapers, books, media, reports, articles, etc. The methods predominantly qualitative, which help to focus on meaning, experience, and context, and the methodology, ethnographic and place-based. Together, these prioritize lived experience and centers place, both physical and cultural, as fundamental to understanding human experience. They treat geography, landscape, history, and local knowledge not just as background, but as active forces that shape identity, relationships, power, and meaning. Chapters and subchapters are organized around inductive themes that revealed themselves after coding the interviews and field notes. The book will use what's called a dual lens format, which in this case is a combination of a personal or island residence and sometimes my narrative lens paired with an analytical lens. So this means writing from an intimate, lived, or emotional perspective, using anecdotes and subjective experiences, bringing in first-person voices, emotional resonance, human connection, and vulnerability. While the analytical lens brings in research in the broader context, linking the personal to larger forces or systems. It'll include structural analyses like of power, race, class, policy, helping the reader see the systems and structures underlying the personal experience. So syncing then with narrative nonfiction, the book will tell true stories using the tools of fiction, like characters, scene descriptions, and narrative arc. This will anchor the narrative and bring readers into the world that was the Ile de Jean Charles resettlement process unfolding from 2016 to 2024. Some of my goals for what this book will do are to not just tell what happened, but show how it felt. Elevate the Indigenous voices and experiential wisdom of those who participated in the process, attend to power relations and equity within the interconnected geographic, political, economic, and historical contexts. In telling the stories of those who have already gone through the process of relocation, this book will also serve as a warning for the future. We have to center well-being by addressing the traumas, chronic and acute stressors, and dwindling federal resources allocated for these efforts. We need to build individual, community, and organizational capacities, including collaborative planning, so that folks can effectively and as smoothly as possible make decisions for themselves. And of course, we can't forget about the receiving communities either, which was, in this case, yet another contentious chapter. Despite extensive media and academic coverage, including hundreds, maybe at this point 1,000 news articles, and nearly 80 peer-reviewed publications referencing the project just in 2024 alone, first-hand accounts from most of the residents are largely absent. I hope to offer interdisciplinary scholars and the general public much needed insights into this resettlement process from the islanders' perspectives, as well as contribute to strategies for future relocation efforts, lessons learned, and best practices for community-driven relocation planning. The book will also touch on ways to support those who do not want to move. This slide is a photo of Edison Dardar, who passed away about a year and a half ago and was an outspoken advocate for the island and his decision to stay. There are two different signs that he posted at various times over the years. You can probably read the top one, but I will read the bottom one for you. We are not moving off this island. If some people want to move, they can go, but leave us alone. People have the right to live where they want, not where people tell them to go and live. They say the island is fading away. Soon we will not have an island left. If the island is not good, stay away. May God bless the island. The next steps for me and this book will be a one-year appointment as the Laborde Endowed Chair for Sea Grant Research and Technology Transfer at Louisiana Sea Grant that will start in 2 weeks. I will focus predominantly on writing this book, but in addition, I'll be interviewing Louisiana Sea Grant extension agents and specialists about their on-the-ground observations regarding conversations and actions around mobility and connecting them to the Ile-de-Jean-Charles case study and broader adaptation research in a report. Both projects are designed to enhance public understanding of relocation as a practical adaptation approach and help ensure that future relocation efforts are community-driven, historically and culturally sensitive, and center equity, justice, and well-being. Thank you all so much for your attention.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Noah Gotlib. I'm an architect and researcher based in Toronto, Canada, and I'm here to present my work, a kind of long-term research art project of mine called Crumbling Land, which is studying climate migration's impact on property and sovereignty in North America. The project is focused primarily on photography and film and is composed of the stories of dozens of absent sites across the continent. While it was no longer affiliated with any institution, I kept the project going through the generous support of the Canada Council for the Arts, which is our version of National Endowment for the Arts, and recently the Graham Foundation based out of Chicago. So over the course of this talk, I want to discuss the general perspective behind the project, the research done, and the future developments. Sorry, just a second. Sorry. So the project began as a thesis at the Architectural Association in London, where I studied and lived for many years and worked in landscape architecture. And it started as a sort of long-term initiative to study the process which we now all know as managed retreat. And my interest in it came from the fact that I think that this process is very little understood or talked about within the realms of architecture. There's the kind of sliding scale between architecture, landscape architecture, urban planning, and then finally the sort of adaptation policy. But among the sort of world of architects, I was always mystified by how little these kind of issues are talked about. I think in part because the practice of managed retreats sort of negates the very thing that we were taught that our job is about, which is about creating buildings, and this is about removing them. Even though architects have for years dealt with absence and removal as a method of artistic practice, like Gordon Matta-Clark's Splitting, or just down not far from here in Soho, Alan Sonfist's Time Landscape, where he convinced the Parks Department to enclose a little bit of square, which is now turned into a mature forest that is representative of what Manhattan was like before colonization. So my interest in managed retreat really stems from an interest in painting and photography and sort of the history of those things within the North American context, because for centuries the idea of the frontier has provided settler society in North America with a powerful metaphor for independence, mythologizing those who ventured into the wilderness to achieve self-sufficiency and escape perceived tyranny. So anything from the Pilgrims fleeing religious persecution to Thomas Jefferson's idea of the yeoman farmer as a foundation for democratic society, to the Loyalists fleeing to Canada after the American Revolution, to Thoreau's solitude at Walden Pond. There's this constant sort of emphasis of outward movements and this movement towards like a sort of pristine frontier as this kind of symbol of colonial expansion and settlement. So part of what I wanted to do was to sort of have a dialogue with the sort of like artistic representation of that, whether that was through lithography or photography or painting, and basically go out and visit as many of these places as I can and sort of document it. So what I found really particularly interesting about managed retreats, especially buyouts, is that it's I think it undermines in a very core way the sort of common conceptions and assumptions about property in North America. So where 50 years ago maybe property ownership was viewed as the ultimate expression of autonomy, especially in like post-war boom, climate change has inverted the narrative. So the imagery of the frontier offered people an outlet where discontent could sort of be diffused through the promise of land ownership and self-sufficiency, but as home ownership becomes increasingly unattainable and vast tracts of land become uninsurable and unlivable, this myth is sort of being turned inwards. So a lot of my interest in this came from the sort of being interested in public space and sort of common space in particular, which is something that is very absent of a lot of cities in the US and Canada. I was very interested in the potential of these sites to kind of create a new sort of basis for the emergence of sort of free spaces. So the work of James Scott, the political scientist at Yale, was very influential for this whole project because he talked about societies that sort of the Western imperial imagination views as primitive, instead being sort of acts of deliberate attempts to escape state subjugation or other kinds of subjugation and basically find freedom in an area of ground that is not accessible to the state. So a kind of micro example, like he talked about that in the context of the Southeast Asian highlands, which is quite a large area, but even within the United States, there used to be versions of this, like the Great Dismal Swamp on the border of Virginia and North Carolina, which for a century and a half was provided a effective natural shield for maroons, escaped slaves, to venture into areas where slave catchers could not navigate the incredibly dense and difficult terrain, and not only escape from the slavers, but also create their own independent societies within the midst of this landscape, and basically use the sort of difficulty of the terrain to create a sort of political autonomy. So Scott, in his work, maintained that his analysis of Zomia or Southeast Asian highlands was not relevant to the modern era, because he argued that rapid enclosure and surveillance of terrain brought about by globalization has closed off the possibility of such autonomous zones occurring again. Yet this logic of evasion offers a useful lens for understanding the political potential of today's retreat zones. As climate change progresses and the state's reach recedes, the geographic conditions that supported Zomia, or his name for the Southeast Asian highlands, are reappearing much more fragmented and less remote, but still potent in their potential for autonomy. So that's the kind of the general sort of background I have with sort of approaching this, and I was working on this kind of purely as a sort of academic exercise for some time until I, about a year ago, got support from the Canada Council to not just read and research and write about these sites, but actually go to them and really try to cover a wide breadth of areas that basically everything from the extremely rural to the extremely urban. So neighborhoods in the middle of New York City to extremely remote communities in the in the plains of North Dakota. So as of now, this is some of the 40 odd sites that have been visited in, I think, 9 states and 2 provinces so far. And the first was, I'm going to go through sort of like a list of some of the spots visited. The first was a trip through the Midwest of the US, and I was very interested in visiting this region for a number of reasons. The first is that in contemporary managed retreat, it is the place where a lot of the early experiments with what we now consider managed retreat were basically born. First in the 1920s and 30s, and later in the 1980s and 90s, and the sort of the huge explosion of buyouts that occurred after the flooding of the Mississippi River in 1993. So we, along with a couple of architect and artist friends went on a month-long trip to document these sites. Places such as Cedar Rapids, Iowa, which is the largest contiguous buyout in the Midwest, which is I think 1,350 homes, almost a square kilometer of the city removed after a massive flood in 2008. And I think in places like these, there's the potential for creating a sort of new public space in the middle of cities, because these are the sort of areas that you're left with, which is the scraped away absence of any kind of private settlements, but all the remains of the sort of public infrastructure, the roads, the trees, the light poles, like now they're starting to scrape it away. But I think in the original condition where they just removed the houses, there was a radical potential for this to be re-envisioned as a new kind of public space where you basically had all of the infrastructure for a public park. But I think ended up tearing out the 100-year mature tree cover along with all the streets, and are in the midst of turning it into something that we now more normally recognize as a park, in order that the area not be misconstrued with, I mean, I hate to use the word blight, but I think that's what they would be thinking of, that they don't want it to appear derelict. So it has to be completely redone, but in the meantime you have the full infrastructure of a park and a 100-year-old forest, which I think is a beautiful foundation for creating a massive new public space in a city that may not have the budget necessarily to do this. So among many of the examples I saw, the most successful post-buyout adaptations for land use wise were the ones that actually had less money. Because through having less money, they are able to make the small incisions necessary for people to basically inhabit the land and use it as they wish. So this was the kind of massive trip through all of these sites in Iowa, in Kaskaskia, Illinois. And another side of this, which is, I think it was very important to explore tangents on this sort of wider idea of retreat as a kind of general phenomenon in the history of the continent, and in the Midwest, that's the proliferation of communal settlements. We all know about the 1960s counterculture and the hippies, but in the 1840s and 50s, there was an enormous explosion of communal activity across the Midwest. There were over 100 settlements established in just a couple of short years. Some of them are still with us today, such as the Mormons, who would occupy this town called Nauvoo, which briefly eclipsed Chicago in population before they were driven out by the surrounding non-Mormons. And then they were later taken over by a utopian French socialist commune. So basically building on this sort of empty shell of the community, who then left after a couple of years as well. So they're and a lot of these are actually in quite a lot of proximity to the contemporary managed retreat sites, like along the riverfront of the Mississippi and the Missouri and the Ohio rivers. The second trip was through the Canadian prairies and the upper, like the sort of northern prairies through Manitoba and North Dakota. And this was to explore a region called Devil's Lake, which is a very peculiar closed basin in this extremely flat landscape of the northern prairies, which has grown by 3,000% since the 90s. It's swallowed an area of land the size of New York City in just about 25 years, because it's a closed basin with no outlet to any ocean. So the water levels fluctuate rapidly, and some homes are under 30 feet or 10 meters of water in certain areas. And it's also absorbed parts of two whole towns, such as Minnewacan in North Dakota. You can see the imprint of the church and the barriers that they've started to create to prevent its basically the town's absorption. And another, Church's Ferry, which was completely absorbed, so it was deincorporated just a few years ago. And unlike many of the other sites I've visited, they created this very strange memorial or tombstone to the town itself and its century and a bit of history. But also in the sort of tangents of retreats, the term managed retreat is usually criticized as having sort of military connotations, and I think that's very apt because a lot of the infrastructure that created a lot of these sort of very cataclysmic floods were developed by the military. But in this region, you also have the former site of the US's main missile defense systems, which are now eclipsed by the internal need to control flooding. So in addition to these sort of submerging landscapes, you have a landscape littered with these kind of bizarre fixtures of the Cold War, just not nearby. I mean, this strange like Toblerone looking structure is about 25 stories high. And the landscape is so flat, you can see it from about 30 miles away when you're driving, which is very strange in this kind of incredibly flat marshland. and meeting in the little town nearby with one of the former contractors who was showing me his home movies, which were very peculiar. So after finishing this work, and this was at the end of August last year, I came to live in New York City for a few months in a very peculiar situation. I was living on Governor's Island on south of Wall Street, which you need a ferry to get to. It's not Roosevelt Island, it's a different island, which it's got that question a lot. And basically turning the research that I collected over the course of the last couple of months into sort of the draft of a film, which I'm planning on exhibiting at a gallery in New York City early next year, at a place called Citigroup, which is not the bank, it's with a Y, a small architecture-focused gallery in the Lower East Side. And I was really excited to be able to present this work in New York, one, because it's been great to show it in New York City, but also New York, unlike Toronto, where I'm from, has a particular concentration of people working in climate adaptation. So I think it's a really interesting way to sort of overlap that sort of people in the art world and people in the sort of policy and adaptation and science space. This was sort of material created for the exhibition pamphlets, and if the video works, this is a short clip from it.
Everybody is organized somehow. Somebody that was younger, they had to attend the party. A lot of people that seniors who had everything paid off. So yeah, there's nobody that. Well, and that's the situation when you were asking about. Two situations. You got the people on the far west side of town. I'm going to have to go in and rebuild probably 90% of my home. The other side of town, and they maybe have 5 or 6 years. Okay, well, emotional, I'm looking here. I raised my family. Buried in the backyard, and we have one tree. But that, I think, is what is forcing a lot of people back into these disaster situations. That emotional battle. What can I salvage and what can I hang on to, or who I move on?
So that was a clip of an interview of Dennis Knobloch, who was the mayor in the 90s of Velmeyer, which was one of the towns that was completely wiped out by the floods of the Mississippi after the levees gave way. And he was responsible for one of the most successful but also peculiar acts of managed retreat in the US. It's become a very celebrated and very oft referenced example because it was a complete relocation of the community. It wasn't by force, it was still a voluntary process, but still about 70% of the residents of Velmeyer, his town, chose to relocate. And within a year and a half, they had acquired FEMA funds and built an entirely new town just a mile away, but on top of 300 feet up on the bluffs. So no more chance of flooding. But there's this interesting parallel between what I call double towns, of which there's only about 15 or so in North America so far. There's a couple more in planning. You have the new town where everybody lives, which looks like a suburb, basically a little exurb, and then the old town, which is streets, fire hydrants, light poles, but no houses, except for the few who chose to stay for various reasons. And unfortunately, when we were driving through, we narrowly missed this. On the 4th of July, they have an annual parade where they go from the new town down to the old town, and people lay out their blankets on the places where their houses used to be, and then they watch the parade together. And then they go all the back up to where they now live. So there's this really intense connection that people have with just even the empty patch of grass that still carries the emotional weight and is still fully accessible and, is not of any danger to them anymore, but it's, he managed to basically single-handedly sort of prevent the dissolution of the community. And another reason it was kind of, this is my sort of one aside into the case studies, but another reason it's interesting is that it was one of the only examples where a community improved its financial situation after retreating. And that's for a very peculiar reason. It's because FEMA demanded that they buy the mineral rights for the land, for the ground underneath, which is full of limestone quarries for creating concrete, for concrete and aggregate. So they bought it and they were like, what do we do with these huge caverns? We have to stop people from, wandering in. And then they had the very simple, brilliant idea of turning it into a giant cold storage facility. So underneath this town, this little model suburb on a hill, there's the vast storage space for the National Archives and Records Administration and the Midwest Distribution Center for Little Caesars Pizza. So when you're beneath this place, it's the caverns go underneath the entire town. It's almost half a square kilometer of underground spaces. You just see box trucks of pizza and then like this government's facility underneath. But there's no municipal tax because the rent from the facility contributes to 100% of the town's revenue. And they're able to pay for the whole school that way and everything, and it works incredibly well. So it was a very peculiar but very fortunate situation for them. So part of what I want to do sort of for the sort of expansion of the project and its eventual growth into the exhibition next year is to work both with the kind of personal community examples, but also work with data and analytics, which is something that I'm, sort of an amateur at, but quite interested in. Because another thing I was very curious about from a very early point is I don't know how many properties have undergone buyouts across the US and Canada. I don't think anyone has like an actual number for that. The number that's usually given is 43,000, and that's specifically from the FEMA Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, like that one single program, but the actual number is probably much higher than that. And I just say 50,000, but it's higher. So I'm just kind of curious to sort of map out these sites and sort of understand where everything is. I mean, this is just a tiny little map of names, which will sort of form this kind of new map of the continent through places that have undergone full or partial relocation. And also sort of creating that in terms of the century before the show, basically. The dots representing one property or collection of properties across the US and Canada. And most of the project is focused on the States so far, but I think I definitely want to pivot to Canada at some points because unlike the States, Canada has had a couple very strange and extreme programs. You'll see this start to emerge here. Newfoundland, which was an independent dominion of the British Empire before joining us as the 10th province, underwent this very extreme centralized program of population relocation. The premier, who is quite sort of in favor of state planning and sort of a socialist, he basically envisions speeding up urbanization through paying people across the province's hundreds of isolated fishing communities to leave and move into emerging cities like St. John's, the capital. So over 20 years, 300 towns were relocated. They were done through plebiscites. You had to have a 90% vote in favor, in which if that passed, everyone would have to leave. And this is an extremely contentious issue in Newfoundland to this day, as it basically destroyed a centuries-old way of life. And the explosion of, this is actually, when you see this here grow, right after 1993, when the Mississippi flood starts. This is the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program that starts to, that big splotch in the middle is Metro St. Louis. So yeah, this is still very much a work in progress, but it's part of the things that will become part of the exhibition in the future. And yeah, more can be found at Crumbling Land, which is the project website, which is just crumbling.land, or on Instagram. So it's slowly developing. So thank you very much.
I'd now like to welcome you to do the Q&A session. So if anyone has any questions. And if there's questions online, I'll read them out.
Thanks everyone, really great presentations. I think this could probably be a question for everybody, but it was spurred when Jessica made a comment about how, this one case has really influenced a lot of the discourse about migration and climate change across the nation. And so I was just wondering if there's some examples in your work of how some of these individual cases of community, relocation, how that gets sort of taken up in the, kind of larger public consciousness, and whether that influences policy in some tangible way. I'm just curious about that. It sort of, my question kind of started with your presentation, but I thought, maybe some of your case studies, gives you some insight in there too, and some of your work just generally.
So your question is then, how do the case studies become part of like a narrative around climate relocation?
Right. I mean, I think that was something that you had said, just in terms of how does this one case sort of influence like the broader conversation, but not just like a discourse, also like maybe has some real policy
implications. Yeah. I mean, I think in the case of Village on Charles, there was a tremendous amount of media attention that put it into the discourse, of course, and because it was $48.3 million for a pretty small group of people. I think, in that New York Times article, there's comments like, well, why don't we just give everyone $1 million, or why is there so much money for a small group of people? So there was a lot of attention that way. But I think, to be honest, and I talked about this, but like it was incredibly contentious. There was a lot of fodder for the media to capitalize on. And I think part of like a huge part of why I think that this book needs to be written, because there is so much that went wrong in the Illusion Charles resettlement that we need to talk about. And I think hear from the folks that moved, and what are their perspectives about how we can do this better.
Trying to think of some of the of all the places that I went to, Velmeyer is definitely, I mean, it's certainly not as famous as Illusion Charles, but it's maybe, I would maybe venture it's the second, because of its kind of cohesion and kind of high level of buy-in amongst the people who participated. But it's also not the first example of that. There were when I asked them that their inspirations for it were actually something that happened in the 1930s, which Shawneetown, Illinois, which we also visited, was the first federally funded relocation of an entire town. But that would not fall under climate change purposes. Now it was seasonal flooding. Yeah, so you mean like how people, like how certain precedents basically inform a sort of wider discourse? Is that what you mean? I mean, there's certain, I don't know, I feel like the ones that get the most purchase are the sort of appeal in the popular consciousness in the media, or the small communities. But that's actually not, when you think about the bulk of retreat sites, it's happening in suburbs. It's happening in like sort of urban, like peripheral urban areas. It's I mean, that doesn't take away from the plight of any people who are living in these places, but just the image, the idea, like even as you showed, that the fact that the island can be captured in a single photograph, it's sort of, that makes it kind of packageable as like a product to sort of explain what was going on, which is kind of why I wanted to go to Devil's Lake in the first place, because it was this kind of absurd sort of like, I would do that before anyone tries to exaggerate it. It's like that's already the most exaggerated version of it you could find, like the sort of Great Western Grid, just filling up with water like a sponge.
And I'm so sorry, well, like one more follow-up question. Have you noticed any, since you said like so much of this is suburban areas, like have you been, is part of your work looking at some of the connections between, like white flight into suburbs and kind of the socioeconomic and racial kind of composition of communities and how that relates to this?
Yeah, I want to get more into that, but from the ways that I've been approaching it, I don't have as much of a expertise in like data analytics and kind of computer science to be able to do that properly, because the data set that I showed in that animation is it's publicly available data from FEMA. But when you download it from the site, it only has the zip code and it doesn't get any more granular than that. Of course, they have everybody's address that was released from somebody from NPR who filed a Freedom of Information Act request. And the reason they didn't want to show that is because when you key people's individual addresses with more granular data about income and race, it turns out obviously from them, the people there who were getting the buyouts tended to be a lot richer and a lot whiter. So they wanted to hide that information. So it's but in terms of like the people, at least the people I've talked to in all of these different places, the most common arguments, I have a skewed sample because I'm only speaking to the people who are there. I haven't really engaged so much with the receiving communities, but it's just, this is my home and I'm gonna stay here regardless of the risks, or I wasn't getting fairly compensated. It's sort of one of those two responses. But primarily that this is home, like the great quote you had.
Thank you.
No, I'm not quite sure how to phrase this, so bear with me. Do you see a greater influence from kind of ecological factors or from kind of like a national discourse, like kind of what the milieu around risk and things like that would be? Which one might be greater, or have you seen maybe no difference?
I don't know, I was always struck by like I got the exact same criticisms of FEMA and the buyout process from people in like radically different life situations, like a farmer in southern Illinois who's probably super MAGA, very very conservative, very isolated, and a woman who runs like a community land trust in Queens, as part of one of the Edgemere CLT. And they had the exact same criticisms of this. So the fact that you can't run on a platform of managed retreat or funding managed retreat, or I haven't seen anyone try, that kind of places it, at least the way I see it, like it places it almost outside politics in a certain way. I mean, it is political, obviously, but it's like in discourse, like no one can really mention it, like in any kind of proactive way. So it just places it outside of discussion. So therefore, people from all walks of life have more, at least from my experience, more common criticism. So if you sit people in a room who might disagree about practically everything else, you'd find them agreeing about that, which I think is hopeful in terms of the reform of it. But seeing the way that things are going recently with not being able to rely on the federal governments anymore for this, it's not the best.
Thank you.
My question is for the first two presenters, Maida Owens and Jessica Sims. For a public that might not immediately grasp the value of cultural connection to land, what are the most compelling arguments or narratives you use to explain why this connection is vital for well-being, adaptation, and social stability?
Louisiana has a much more awareness of culture than many places. We have an intense attachment to place. We have 400 festivals celebrating our cultures. So it's not that hard of a sell, quite honestly. I know colleagues in other parts of the country that it's like, why cultural heritage or anything, and it's like that, that's not a hard sell in Louisiana. Would those of you in Louisiana, do y'all agree? My whole career has been enmeshed in that, so I'm sure my perception is skewed. But no, it's not actually a hard sell. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's almost you almost can't explain it. You just see feel it. People just know it. It is just a part of them.
And that doesn't mean funding follows.
Sure.
But there is an appreciation for it. Of why this is important. Just talking with, or just watching your Facebook feed or something, people are talk about the importance of their local culture and their traditions, their family traditions.
I think too, another piece of it is the nativity rate in Louisiana, which means that if you're born there, you stay there. If you leave, you come back, and that's the highest, and it has been for like 30 some years, right, in Louisiana. So people are connected to each other, to their families, and down the bayou, you'll still go and you'll find like a whole family that's a block, and they get together at least once a week and celebrate culture, so to speak.
Yeah, I've heard it referred to as sticky. We're a sticky state. We in Pennsylvania alternate between having the highest rate of native-born residents in the country regularly, and have for, I don't know how long, but for a long time. And we like to hire Louisiana people that go away and get degrees and come back. I've watched that over and over and over. And then people from Louisiana will go to the universities in Louisiana and then wonder why they can't get a job. It's like, well, you should have gotten a degree elsewhere and then you would have been hired.
Question for you, Noah. I was curious why you chose the phrase crumbling land. You're looking at a big time span and a big spatial, footprint. Do you see that pathos throughout, or is it to capture the spirit of this moment when it is so painful?
I think both. I wanted to sort of look at it in both the kind of the scale of the moments of people's decision and the disaster that motivated people to leave, but also the sort of geological timescale almost, and also at least the couple centuries of history that I'm sort of particularly focusing on. And I think the erosion, I think the reason I chose it is because years ago I was very interested in the development of the Jeffersonian grid and how the central part of North America has one contiguous urban plan the size of India, which is just a completely insane means of living, and imposing static boundaries onto property leads to erosion, basically. Like that whole manner, like that's what led to the Dust Bowl, the intensive farming and the constant incision of the land leads to its disintegration. So I think the crumbling is kind of a sort of the flip of that, and seeing how that is undone, basically how different forms of erosion and disintegration are creating new spaces that are actually more stable in a way than the way that people, were living on it for at least 150 years, basically, from the moments the grid began to be sort of developed. And I think that's also, again, why I included the North Dakota examples, to kind of get that out of my system, to sort of, because when you're in that space, it's actually incredibly harsh and kind of brutal. But it's that was sort of my thinking behind it.
It's something all three of your projects are doing. It's in some instances proven to be a nice factor for people who are choosing to leave or facing that decision, is commemorating their community's existence. I mean, that tombstone isn't peculiar. Somebody thought it was important to mark that there had been a community there and to recognize that community sacrifice in deciding to move itself. Just as Valmeyer's residents come back and actually, reoccupy the land someday. But there's a lot of instances where, that has become an important piece of recognition, I think, that helps people have some closure, or it helps them see like there was some recognition that we used to be here. We chose or forced by circumstances to relocate somewhere else. So I think it's something to be, there's examples in Japan of like tsunami stones where when a tsunami has come through, something was erected to show, one, where the high water was, to serve as a warning, and two, to also recognize that there was a traumatic event that left its impression on the human residents and the landscape itself. So, I mean, I think something that's worth exploring in your work. And it helps people get some closure too, I think, as well, so.
Yeah, in Louisiana, a lot of communities are actively collapsing without relocation plans, And there's a small town, Chauvin, south of Homa. And three elementary schools were badly damaged by Hurricane Ida in 2022, I think. And so they just closed all those schools and are consolidating the few people that are remaining in one elementary school. And so one person organized a reunion of everybody who attended those elementary schools, and it was huge. So it's monument on the landscape, but it's also events.
I think I use the word peculiar because having been to a number of these places, I think that people don't want to have that finality, actually. I think like in Valmeyer, talking to people there, they say, we live up here, but we're from there. So they don't want, I wouldn't see them putting a tombstone on it. Like another place I visited, Kaskaskia, which is on the Mississippi in Illinois. There's basically just a couple of houses there in the church, but then there are people who did not relocate to a new built community, they just spread across the region. But they still on Sunday all go to the same church, which has been there for 300 years, and they still pray in the same church, and then they disperse again. So once a week, the town fills up with 200 people, and then an hour later, they're all gone again. So I think, I don't think they want finality. I don't think they need finality. I think that relationship to place that's one of the things that interests me so much about it, is that it's sort of semi-mobile. And it has like almost a deeper connection with the land through being mobile. And it's the only gravestone I've encountered so far. But if there are more, I'd love to know about it.
I have a question for Maida, which is that you shared, that there will be conflicts between newcomers and long-timers, so to speak. And I think I was really curious to hear more about how the work you've done has addressed that. If you couldn't give some specific examples, because I was super excited to see all the different formats that you guys were working with, and what I was maybe missing, like to make all the dots connect in my head, is were you trying to create a kind of regional identity so that folks who are getting dislocated from one area are connected even if they have relocated, or how are these conflicts kind of being?
Well, the conflicts can be, like when Chauvin moves to Homa, 10 miles away, there's conflict.
Right.
When Homa moves to Thibodeau, there's, that they don't want the new people.
Right.
There's Arnaudville is a small town that's further west and north of I-10, so it's kind of outside of the hurricane zone, but that's not actually true. You're not getting storm surge there though. And the long-term residents really resent that there's this artist colony growing, that people are buying land to bilocate or not necessarily completely move. So when I was in Baton Rouge after Hurricane Katrina, when 100,000 people showed up overnight.
Right.
And it definitely changes things. And one of the examples in Baton Rouge that was most intense with the conflict was the youth. There were the 225s, our Baton Rouge area code, and the 504s, and they clashed big time. This was bad enough to get in the newspapers regularly. So now I did hear a presentation once that said there's not necessarily conflict, and I want to find an example of when there hasn't been. So that got me really curious about what are the strategies to deal with that. So I drew on, there's a lot of work in immigration and refugee work, and within folkloristics with immigrants and refugees. And there are strategies. One of the best is called Bridging Divides. Can't remember the whole title, but it was the last field scan by Arts Place America. And you could just search and replace immigrant with migrant and or new, but it's excellent. The other there's art of community out of the folklore world, and these are a part of the workshops that I do. And then the National League of Cities also had a publication on how 7 cities around the country are dealing with this. So they're real practical cultural strategies of helping people get to know each other. You know, I would like to think it's harder to hate somebody if you know them, but that may be my idealism, you know. But there's a whole body of work on that, and I go into all that in my workshops.
Do you see that that's evolved at all as the frequency and severity of displacing storms has picked up a bit? Do you find that kind of outsider wall is eroded a little bit? Sorry, tired analogy.
No, the storms are definitely intensifying, they're more frequent. For the first time in my life, I had to evacuate, after Ida. I think the more disruption, and people are off kilter, they just. And so any long-term resident that suddenly has enough people, because there's some places that it just kind of filters in real slowly, so it's more like they're sneaking in. But I realized in one of the houses I lived in until a few years ago is one side was what we called a Katrina house, and that's a house that New Orleans people buy to evacuate to. The other side was St. Bernard people who relocated, because Baton Rouge is a major receiving community, even though it doesn't acknowledge that. And that's because of jobs and houses. That's where you go for, all the places you have to choose, you need a job. It's mainly about livelihood, relocating.
I think we're out of time, but there's no session afterwards, so if anyone. I mean, yeah, you could.
I'd like to hear Nathan's.
So, yeah, go.
Well, I have a question. Sorry.
No, it's
Thanks. I have a question. One question for all of you and one question, Jessica, for you. I was curious about the fund that you wanted to start for the book and what those funds would go to and who would steward those funds. And then I also had a question about, because you brought up in your presentation, so importantly, Indigenous sovereignty. And I just wanted to hear in all of your work how you're engaging with that idea. I mean, it's kind of complicated, especially in changing ecosystems, and so would like to hear more about that.
Sure, the community fund, I don't know who would steward the funds, but when I talked to all of the residents about writing this book, I basically said that, the state is not going to pay for their insurance come for some folks, I think next year. Their property taxes are not covered. Folks are going to have trouble paying their bills. So I wouldn't be writing this book without these people. So it wouldn't be right if this book makes any money to share that with them. And I don't that's what I've told them. I haven't thought about who would steward the funds, whether it would be like a mutual aid fund or what, I don't know. I welcome your suggestions.
I have some for you.
Okay. Super.
Community funds, that they could play a powerful role.
Yeah. I agree. I think they're gonna need it. And the sovereignty piece, that is an excellent question. It's a I don't know how to answer that question in relation to the folks at the New Isle. I think they many of them have different thoughts about it, and let you know when I get to that piece.
Yeah, the sort of land back or land ownership initiatives from indigenous nations is something that's very complicated and something I wasn't able to totally do justice to. I think in Canada, a lot of it that I've researched is it's seen kind of in a weird way as an opportunity to reclaim traditional land use practices, specifically, like nomadicism. Among certain northern communities that were forced into sedentary life by the Canadian state, which has a very long and very brutal history of doing that, especially in the north where sedentary life never existed because it's not possible to have a sedentary life when you can't grow stuff. But they were forced into these communities and therefore become dependent on the state. So as part of it is like, it's almost a form of state exit to be able to kind of reclaim ground again and move away from like the basically the towns that the RCMP and the government put them in places like Nunavut and Northern Ontario. But it's still something I need to look into a lot more. But when I say like the double towns, like these kind of copies, most of the new ones that are under development now that have yet to be completed, most of them are Indigenous nations. There's two in Washington, one called Queets and another one called Taola, which are part of the same tribal group. And there's another one called Little Saskatchewan in Manitoba, which was just completed like last year, which is a new double town. So those, the First Nations governments in both the US and Canada definitely have a strong role in that because there's a greater incentive there to stay local and not to disperse the community. That's the governments and the culture don't permit that quite rightly. So there's a lot of experimentation in how these new land forms are being produced. There's even one in northern Canada called Tuktoyaktuk, which is kind of like, it's almost like the Arctic mirror of Ile de Jean Charles. It's in a very similar position in being in a narrow jetty sticking out into the Beaufort Sea, and it's sinking as well because it's on permafrost and they will have to relocate eventually. So they actually have like a sort of website where they're sort of looking around to the global examples, especially within North America, including Ile de Jean Charles, looking at key lessons and takeaways for their own kind of eventual move.
Several of the tribal communities in Louisiana are looking for other land. They have a lot of pushback some of them have pushback from members who don't want to consider it at all, but yet the reality, that some people are looking at the possibility. And I know of one tribal leader who's in a film saying, "I'll die here," and now they're looking at, well, maybe we might need to investigate land to relocate. But I think the core problem is moving to a new ecosystem. Because you're likely, that so many people in Louisiana, especially on the extreme coast, they live off the land. And so when they move away from that land, they're very likely to face food insecurity. Now, gardens can eventually be reestablished, but you can't, when you could walk out your door and pick up crab nets and get crabs for dinner, you move away from the bayou and that source of protein is gone. And crabs out of a seafood, that's expensive. When I used to have a fisherman in the family, and after he passed away, I found out how expensive fish was. Fish just showed up on your door, And that's true of so many other things, but so some things you can relocate, but it's the moving to a new ecosystem that is the real challenge and the food insecurity problems with that. But that's true for everybody that's in South Louisiana and not just the indigenous communities.
Thank you.